Hi, I'm Angela Morabito with the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform. I'm here today with Corey Liu, a partner at Ashcroft Law Firm in Austin, Texas. Corey has just recently filed an amicus brief in the case of Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard. And Corey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
This case is so interesting because it deals with what's called, or what used to be called, affirmative action. But now it's called something different. And you reference in the brief that Harvard is giving something called tips to students based on their race in the admissions process. How does that work?
So when students apply to Harvard, they can check what their race is on the application. And Harvard will then use that racial self-identification in terms of giving a preference to students of certain races. And so the tip is that's their admissions insider lingo for how they award preferences to students of certain races. And so the fascinating thing about this case is we're getting to unpack all the facts of how Harvard actually practices affirmative action within, we see their internal emails, some of these documents. And so tips, that's the term they use for the preference they give based on race.
And it's a pretty significant preference, right? One of the things you mentioned in your brief is that Harvard sends letters to students who score highly on the PSAT to encourage them to apply. And the bar to get a letter for students of some races and some genders is several hundred points lower than it is for white and Asian men. Why is Harvard doing this? What reason do they give for this inequity?
They just say, we want students of all different backgrounds. That was the testimony at trial. Of course, I think you can tell from the numbers what they're thinking, which is that they want students of certain races, and they're willing to lower the standards in terms of how they recruit based on people's race. And so the evidence showed that for Black and Hispanic students, there was a certain PSAT score that would get you an invitation letter from Harvard. There was a different score that you needed if you were a white or Asian woman, a different set of, different standard if you were a white or Asian man. And then the interesting thing was that in what they called sparse country, which, it sounds like they're talking about rural areas, but actually encompasses 20 states, cities like Las Vegas and New Orleans and Phoenix. But from what they call sparse country, they then have a separate standard for white students compared to Asian students. So actually, if you're Asian in sparse country, you have the same standard for the PSAT score as anywhere else in the country. But then if you're white, it's a little bit lower standard to get the invitation. And so when they were asked about that, Harvard basically said, well, we just want people from all over with all different backgrounds. But of course, it's interesting, when it comes to sparse country, they would apparently would want a white student over an Asian student and have different standards for them.
In the brief, you use the terms arbitrary and irrational to describe these cutoff points. Why is that? What makes them arbitrary and what makes them contrary to reason?
So what we talk about in the amicus brief that I filed with Professor David Bernstein, who's a law professor at the Antonin Scalia Law School, what we talk about is that these racial categories, they weren't designed with the goal of producing the best educational environment on campus. They basically came arbitrarily from the federal government, from bureaucrats who actually, they said, we sort of made up these categories. We really don't think you should be using them in terms of awarding preferences. We just had to make these categories to unify the different categories, different agencies in the federal government were using. And so we kind of unpacked each of the categories. For example, Asian, that encompasses roughly 60% of the world population. It includes both South Asians, people from India, for example, and East Asians, people who are Chinese, and Southeast Asians. So people from so many different countries, many of them don't look alike, they don't speak the same language, they don't have the same food or culture, and yet when they come to the USA, they're all lumped together as Asian. What's the basis for that? There's really never been any explanation for why you would group all these people together. Another interesting thing is that Hispanics include Europeans who are from Spain. Actually, the Hispanic, they call it an ethnicity, which can include people of any race. And so that includes those who are white, but who come from a country with Spanish culture. Where did that come from? Why is that a basis for crafting a student body? How does that determine your potential to contribute to the campus And how is that a fair basis to treat other students worse in the admissions process and give a preference to others? They're arbitrary. They really, no one has a good explanation for why we use these categories. And so if you're going to be imposing higher admission standards and penalizing some students on the basis of race, you need some kind of explanation for it. And I've never heard any explanation.
And admissions here is a zero-sum game, right? There's a finite number of spots in any incoming freshman class. And Harvard is so well known, it's effectively shorthand for the elite Ivy League institutions. And while it has peers, nobody else has the Harvard name. So every seat that someone gets at Harvard is a seat that another student can't really take. So who is losing out here? There are tons of high-achieving kids out there who dream of going to Harvard. They can't all make it in. Who's being kept out unfairly?
Well, the evidence shows that it's Asian Americans in large part. There's so many different factors in terms of how the admissions process works that there's just various steps of the admissions process. So for example, one factor is the personal rating, which has been highly litigated in the trial court, but it basically Harvard claims that it's an assessment of your personality, your characteristics, your intangible qualities, your virtue, your courage, your likability, things like that. And Asians consistently scored the worst on that rating. It also showed that African Americans scored very highly on that personal rating. So it gives rise to the inference that that's being used to penalize Asians. And what's really unfortunate is that Harvard has tried to defend the personal rating. They say, no, it's a fair and objective test. And so basically what they're saying is, no, as an objective matter, Asians do have worse personalities, so it's fair. And so what this is showing is bias in the admissions process, and they're not treating students as individuals, but really using stereotypes to judge students. And unfortunately, Harvard actually did some internal studies that asked the question of whether Asians were being penalized. So they knew this was a problem. People were talking about it. People had raised the question. And so they actually commissioned a study, and they found that basically, if Asians were judged based on academics alone, they could be more than 40% of the class. But then when you add a variety of other factors, including both legacy admissions and athletics and things like that, but also just the race conscious part of it, it had the effect of lowering the number of Asians that ultimately got admitted.
It's just so unfair that after a student goes through 13 years of education, K through 12, they aren't judged as an individual. The school won't give them a fair shake after all the time and effort they've put into getting to where they are and then applying to the school. So I want to talk about something else that's sometimes part of the admissions process, and that's financial need. Most wealthy schools, Harvard, of course, being at the top of that list, have said, we're going to go need blind. And whether or not you can afford the school, we're going to look at you regardless of your financial situation. What do you think of the idea of going race blind? Should race be looked at all? Are there inequalities that this sort of system can address? Or is it just creating the same problem that it's trying to solve?
I think it is possible to use race-blind admissions, and that's actually what happens in the California public school system. California passed a constitutional amendment to their state constitution, and so state universities there can't consider race. And so what we've seen at Berkeley, UCLA, and other state schools in California is that Asians do perform better when there's no racial consideration in the admissions process. So I think it is possible to eliminate the use of race, and that ultimately that's what our anti-discrimination law guarantees. That's what the Constitution guarantees, right? That we're not going to be treated differently based on something that we have no power over, based on something that has nothing to do with our character or who we are as a person or what we've accomplished. And that's the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, the same laws that gave us Brown versus Board of Education. They apply here equally, regardless of who's doing the discriminating and who's the victim of the discrimination. And removing race from the process, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to just go off of your SAT or your GPA. I think there is room potentially for considering socioeconomic diversity, geographic diversity, factors that are not explicitly, that are not race. There may be some correlation with race, but it's different. It's not an attempt to actually create and engineer a certain racial composition in the class, but to bring in students of all races who may have had disadvantaged backgrounds, that wouldn't run afoul of our anti-discrimination law. So it's possible to do some sort of holistic admissions process or to try to serve underserved communities, but it just removes race out of the process. All we're saying is don't use this, this way of sorting people that we've determined as a country is unfair and demeaning and hurts those who are the victims of discrimination.
And in the brief, you talk about how the racial categories that the college is using aren't necessarily right or accurate. I mean, leaving aside the question of is it right to categorize people by race, and I would say no. The categories that they're using in the first place can be really flawed. You mentioned that someone who is ethnically indigenous, who grew up on tribal lands, probably has a really different life experience than someone who doesn't really know what their ethnic background is, maybe grew up in New York City, takes the 23andMe test and finds out that they are part genetically, racially indigenous. So are categories useful at all, or is it time to scrap them entirely?
I think it's time to scrap them entirely. That's what we argue for in the brief. The categories are so broad that they don't do a good job of identifying the actual unique characteristics that make you who you are. So, you can be of a certain race, but maybe come from a privileged background because your parents were highly educated or wealthy. You could be white or Asian and come from an underprivileged background. So race is not a good proxy for your advantage or disadvantage when you grew up. And, the rhetoric that Harvard uses is, we want to look at the whole person. This is holistic. Everyone is treated as an individual. But actually, the evidence showed that they basically just use these categories. They're not going into the details of your particular story, whether you were an immigrant or native born in the US, for example. It's just which of these racial categories do you fall into? They have these things they call the one-pagers. Throughout the admissions process, they're just looking at the breakdown of the class using these racial categories. At the end of the admissions process, they do what they call lopping, which is if the class looks like they've provisionally admitted maybe a couple too many people and they're trying to reach the target size, they need to cut off a few people. They call that lopping, getting the class down to the size they want. And there's actually an email that came out in the trial in which one of the staff at the admissions office says the dean of admissions, he has to lop maybe 20 or so students out of the class, get him his ethnic stats. So at the end of the process, when he was determining who to reject it's obvious they're trying to get to a certain racial composition, and they're considering race in determining who to reject. So they're not treating people as a unique individual looking at your essays or anything like that. In fact, the court found that Harvard will consider your race just based on your self-identification, regardless of whether you talk about it as an important part of who you are. And so they're just using these categories. They're not treating people as individuals and looking at what makes you unique. And so reducing us down to those categories is unfair, it's demeaning, and it's contrary to our Constitution.
And in this admissions process, you talk about these one-pagers. These are a regular occurrence that are going to top brass at the university. This is not a one-off admissions officer maybe trying to game the system. This is a formalized part of the process. Are things like this going on at other schools?
It's quite possible. I think it's likely. Of course, it's hard to get the information. The schools are not transparent about how they use race. They just say, well, it's a holistic process. Everyone gets treated as an individual. That's pretty much all they'll say. And it's only because of the litigation and because the judge required Harvard to turn over these documents that we've been able to see for the first time how Harvard, which is a private university, actually uses race. And so there's the slogan that they have, treat everyone as individual, and then we see how it actually works in practice. They're just looking at the ethnic stats, as the dean of admissions staff called it, and which category you fit into, not actually your unique qualities that make you who you are.
It's a real disservice to these students, to these applicants. And one of the things that you've raised that I'd like to go back to is that no student is forced to identify their race if they choose not to. But when a student does identify their race, the school has no way of verifying that. A person can effectively self-identify as anything they want, and it's sort of Scout's honor. The school isn't really going to check. So what would your advice be to students who are really concerned about not being penalized when they submit their application to go to a school like Harvard? Is it worth it to tell them the truth, or is it better to give them less information?
Well, I think a lot of Asians do. There's been media reports about how a lot of Asians are choosing not to identify their race in their college applications. And so, that might be something that I would advise someone not to do if they were worried about being penalized. Of course, could they tell from looking at your name or your essays, or in the personal rating, in terms of just looking at various parts of your application, trying to guess what your race is, maybe. And then that may end up turning on what your last name is, right? And those are things that are so ugly that a school would try to look at these attributes of someone to try to guess their race and apply possibly very nasty stereotypes. But unfortunately, that's what these schools do. But you're right, they don't make any attempt to verify a student's self-identification, which ties into a point that we make in our brief, which is that if you don't verify what the student's race is, how do you know you're getting honest information? How do you know you're treating students who are in the same situation similarly? That it's interesting, the American Bar Association actually issued a resolution to law schools saying that there's a rampant systemic problem of false identification as Native American among law school applicants. Basically, there's more people applying to law school who say they're Native American than there are Native American lawyers who actually are produced and enter the legal profession. And so they've basically flat out said people are fraudulently identifying as Native American. And you do have examples of people with maybe a marginal claim. It may be honest, but really, if you're 1/8 Hispanic, for instance, or even less, it may be truthful to say that you are Hispanic, but is that really who these policies are targeting? The problem is that they don't define the barriers in terms of what's legitimate and what's an illegitimate self-identification, because once you start going down that path, then you get into nasty stereotypes, right? Oh, can we look at a picture of you, or what is your name, or what languages do you speak, or other kinds of stereotypes that in terms of who is for instance too white, or too Asian, or not black enough, or things like that. Those are questions that we would all agree would be offensive for schools to try to make those determinations about students. And so I think there's no fair, workable way to do this. And so that's why we don't allow race discrimination.
You use an example in the brief of two siblings who applied to college a few years apart, and one marked their ethnicity a certain way and the other marked it differently, but both of them were correct. They both, could claim the race that they said they were on their application. This is just so complicated, and yet the school is fighting this in the court system. They don't want to give it up. What advantage is Harvard getting from this? It seems like something that makes their process very unfair, even racist. It does a disservice to their students. Someone has to be getting something out of this, or else it would have been scrapped long ago, right?
Well, I think, if you ask them about it, they would say, probably because this is what the Supreme Court has said, which is that everyone gets a better education when the class is racially diverse, which I think is a disputable proposition. Perhaps more cynically, my theory is that they use this sort of as a defense mechanism to shield what's an even uglier practice, perhaps, which is their legacy admissions, where they give special preferences to people with, children of donors and alumni and things like that, which is basically just basically favoritism and not based on merit at all. And that's what they use to build their reserves of money and to maintain their power and influence. And so perhaps as a way to shield themselves from scrutiny and criticism on that, they then say, well, we try to also extend opportunity to people of all different races. But the truth is, if they got rid of legacy admissions, then they may be able to actually have a more diverse student body even without using racial preferences, right? I mean, because the lawsuit actually showed that such a huge percentage of students are admitted through legacy preferences, also athletic preferences, and that those benefits do help a lot of white students, that maybe if they just got rid of that kind of nepotism, they would have a more diverse student body and they wouldn't even need to use racial preferences. But then they say, well, we need that to have good relations with our alumni and to keep getting the donor money in. But I don't think trying to get more donor money is a legitimate explanation under our Constitution to discriminate against people on the basis of race.
So if you had to start building an admissions process from the ground up, because I got to be honest, it sounds like the one they have is terrible, burn it to the ground. If you had to create a brand new one, what would that process look like? What would you want students to demonstrate? What would be part of the decision-making process that is or isn't there now?
Well, I think there's actually room for different ways to do admissions processes. And this kind of goes back to the point before where I said, I don't necessarily think every school has to just go to test scores and GPA. I think you could have a good university that looks primarily at just pure academic performance on, let's just say, the SAT, ACT, your GPA, the coursework you took, and didn't even bother with trying to write essays or anything like that. They just kind of went straight on academics. I think there's value to that. There's schools that do that, like Caltech, which focuses a lot on science and engineering. And basically they just said, science is science. We're just going to look at who does the best and recruit, take the best talent that we can get. I also think there is room for schools that may want to extend opportunity to people from different communities, including those that may not have, may traditionally have been impoverished, have not had a lot of people from those communities go to college. Just take race out of the equation. That's all I'm asking. You can look at socioeconomic factors. You can look at whether your parents went to college, all of these factors that are race blind, but which do seek to extend opportunity to communities that may not have very many people who've gone to college. Just don't use race, because these categories, they're arbitrary, it's mechanical, it's not treating people as an individual. And so you can remove race and still look at other factors that extend opportunities to students from different communities.
And you're talking about a process that looks at who students really are, what they've experienced, what they've accomplished, what their life has looked like up to the point of applying for college. And that's a big task. It is significantly harder than making assumptions about a student based on a racial and racist category. So the schools have to do some work here, right?
I think so. At the end of the day, these policies, they're discriminatory. I think it's been politically expedient for Harvard to use it. I think whether for PR purposes, to deflect attention from their legacy admissions and other unfair practices that they engage in. But I don't think trying to solve, trying to hide one unfair process by using another unfair process is the right thing to do. I think the message here is that it's not just, I think they would say, well, we're taking race into consideration to help people, but it's not just to help people, it also hurts people. There are victims. It's funny, if you went to the Harvard trial, you would have heard Harvard's trial lawyers say, we only consider race as a positive. Your race can only help you, it can never hurt you. But of course, I don't need any statistics or PhDs to understand that if you're going to give a boost to certain people, it's effectively a penalty to the other people. And people shouldn't be penalized on account of their race. They should be treated as individuals.
You're describing an admissions process that categorizes people based on race. It makes assumptions about them based on race, and it privileges and disadvantages people based on race. I don't need a Harvard degree to know that that is pretty much textbook racism. Meanwhile, you have Harvard coming out and supporting social justice issues. They are making statements in support of Black Lives Matter. They're actively encouraging an anti-racist campus. And yet their admissions process looks like it flies right in the face of everything they tell their students they believe. Does anybody on the Harvard end of this talk about cognitive dissonance or say that they recognize what they're doing is pretty hypocritical?
I don't think so, not among the Harvard administrators. At least they won't admit that publicly. But I think that is the danger of identity politics, getting too deep into trying to see who's the biggest victim, that ultimately you do end up with policies that themselves are racist because you are so obsessed with trying to distinguish between people of races and pit one group against the other group and see who's a victim, that you end up making race the center of the discussion And we end up with a policy like we have here where they're claiming to be fighting racism, and yet while they're making those statements, when you look at their actions, they're actually discriminating on the basis of race, and there are victims in this process. And Harvard won't admit it, unfortunately, but this lawsuit is at least showing the whole public what Harvard is doing and forcing them to answer the questions that the public has.
And now that the public is seeing this for what it is and realizing what goes on behind closed doors at Harvard, I imagine there are going to be some students and parents who watch this and realize, oh no, the deck is stacked against me, or oh no, Harvard is looking at things that I never thought were going to be part of my application. What would your advice be to them? What can students and parents do to step up and say, hey, I'd like to be treated fairly?
Well, I think joining Students for Fair Admissions and supporting the lawsuit is certainly one way to do that. There are lawsuits against campuses across the country, including Yale, the University of Texas. So I think there's a lot of momentum. Regardless of how this case goes, the issue will continue to be litigated. But I think this case presents a strong set of facts for the Supreme Court to ultimately rule that race discrimination in the college admissions process is wrong, that it was wrong to allow it back in 2003 in the University of Michigan case, and that it should correct that. And so I think the more of us who speak out, the more of us who make it clear that as Asian Americans, we're entitled to the same equal treatment that anyone else of any race is entitled to, the better. Because the danger, unfortunately, in being such a small minority group is that it's very easy to be ignored. And so that's how you end up with a school like Harvard saying they're for racial equality when in fact they're actually victimizing a minority group that's often overlooked.
It's just amazing. And you're petitioning the Supreme Court to hear this case. Let's say the Supreme Court says, you're exactly right, people deserve fairness, that these racist categories are not serving Harvard and they're being tremendously unfair to all of their students. If that decision came down tonight, what would that change about admissions across the country? Would it be a similar overnight change, or is it going to take some extra steps for schools to catch up with what fairness really means?
I think it will take steps. And I think once you proclaim the general principle of equality in the law, then there's questions about how you implement it. And so, after Brown versus Board of Education came down, there continued to be practices in terms of trying to resist racial equality, right? So you had some places where they shut down the schools because they would rather have no schools than have integrated schools. And I'm not saying we're going to see necessarily school shutdowns here, but you may see different schools trying to figure out ways to not comply with the law. And so courts are going to have to fashion orders that enforce the guarantee of racial equality, at least until the school shows that it's committed to doing that. But I think that's, it's a tough issue in terms of how do you make sure they're not considering race once we've banned race as a consideration. But that's how it is in all areas of employment discrimination, for example. If you're going to file an employment discrimination case, you have to look closely at the facts, and it's a factual inquiry. And so I think we have a similar situation here where, once the law said it's illegal to discriminate, then we'd have to get into specifics of different universities. Are they actually complying with that obligation? Maybe they're saying they're complying with it, but if you look under the hood, they're actually secretly discriminating. So that's always a possibility. And I think that'd be something courts will have to look at, down the line. But first step, of course, is let's just at least get the court to say, we acknowledge that it's wrong to discriminate on the basis of race here. Let's get the law correct first. And then afterwards, the courts will figure out how to take the future cases.
That is such a powerful statement that the Supreme Court could make. This case could be a watershed moment for students, for parents, and certainly for schools as well in changing some pretty long-standing policies. So campus reform will continue to follow this issue. We look forward to continuing to cover this case. Corey, Lou, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.